the group is so small, the circle is so small that from an outsider, like I was many years back, you can actually see the center of it, and you can see where it's happening in the epicenter, and you can see the players, and you can get to meet those people and get involved. And what happens when you're like in Sydney or Melbourne? It's such a huge scene. It's like to be on the outside of that. It's completely foreboding and like, oh, I don't even know where to start.
Hey everyone, Liam from Solitude here, and in this video I'm going to take you through the history of the Perth music scene. Now, Perth is my hometown. It's the capital city of Western Australia, and we have about 2 million people that live here. We're also about 2,000 kilometers away from the next nearest capital city in Australia, which is Adelaide, which makes us one of the most isolated capital cities in the world. And with that isolation has brought about a lot of creativity and some great music. You might recognize the likes of Tame Impala, Troye Sivan, the Triffids, Jebediah, just to name a few, and I'm going to talk about them a little more as we get going. Now, when it comes to the history of contemporary music in Perth, the first sort of scene that popped up was a blues music scene in the late 70s, and I don't think this gained a huge amount of traction, and it's not often spoken of nowadays, but it was quickly swept over by the punk phenomenon that was obviously getting big in England and America with the likes of the Sex Pistols and the Ramones. Some of the first bands to delve in the punk scene of Perth were the likes of the Cheap Nasties, the Victims, and the Scientists. The Victims were fronted by Dave Faulkner, who later went on to form Hoodoo Gurus. The Scientists and the Cheap Nasties also had a guy called Kim Salmon in them, who was a pretty influential figure in the Perth music scene throughout this decade. And the Scientists went on to actually have quite an underground influence upon many of the sludge rock and grunge bands of the late 80s and early 90s. Even popping up on a favourites list of Kurt Cobain. As the popularity of the little punk scene here in Perth grew, we saw the likes of some smaller bands pop up. We had people like the Mannequins, the Jugites, the Bamboos, the Kryptonics, all having local success here in Perth. We also had a guy called Dave Warner, or Dave Warner from the Suburbs, who put out some of the first kind of Australiana music around, as far as I know, and was quite influential in that he was one of the early guys to sing in an Australian accent. But the biggest band to come out of this late 70s punk scene wasn't actually a punk band, but they kind of got their influence from there, and that was a group called the Triffids. Now, the Triffids were fans of the local punk scene and started making their own original music, but differed from what the other bands were doing. They were able to kind of take influence from their surroundings in Perth and the culture in Western Australia, and were iconic because of that. The most notable song being Wide Open Road, and the album also Born Sandy Devotional. It's a wide open road. It's a wide open road. The Triffids were also pretty successful overseas. They got on the cover of NME, which is like the English version of the Rolling Stone, and were quite influential in that kind of alternative indie rock scene that was developing in the early 80s. Now, as the 80s progressed, original music in Perth kind of started taking a backseat to the live scene that was mostly run by cover bands. Local venues started prioritizing finding bands who could cover songs over original artists, and it frustrated a lot of the bands who were looking to write and perform their own material. Although we did have some interesting cover bands pop up out of that decade. One of the biggest was a band called V Capri, who also delved in original music, but it didn't really take off. Another notable cover band from Perth was the Ferris Brothers, who changed their name to In Excess when they moved over east, and you know how that went. As the 80s developed, we had the Triffids as the quintessential Perth band, but they kind of started showing the issues when it came to trying to be a band living in Perth and having success making music. So they made their way over east and a lot of people followed suit. What bands and artists were finding was that the labels were all over east, and if you wanted to grow an audience, you had to play in front of bigger shows, and you just couldn't find that in Perth with it being such an isolated capital city. We had other popular artists popping up out of Perth to start, but then they all kind of made their way over east. Bands like Eurogliders with their big song Heaven, Johnny Diesel and the Injectors had an awesome debut album, which you would recognize some of the songs off. Don't you know it's a crying shame? And the lead singer of that band, Mark Lazotte, later changed it to be a solo project just called Diesel, and had huge success over east when he started releasing this material. You'd probably recognize some of these ones. Another noticeable person and band who went over east despite having WA heritage was Susie DeMarchi and the Baby Animals. They just found the success over in the other states and they couldn't get it here in Perth. Obviously we mentioned In Excess as well, and Dave Faulkner took his work to the eastern states too and created Hoodoo Gurus. The rest is history. They went on to be a big band too. Probably the biggest band that didn't move away and stayed true to the pub roots of Western Australia would have been The Boys, who had a pretty big debut album that came out, which got a lot of traction locally. Another big band from the 80s that came from Perth and had a little bit of success living here was The Stems. You might recognize them from their biggest song, At First Sight. But they were one of the first bands to show how difficult it was after having success in Perth first and then trying to move over east and just failing when it came to assimilating into the lifestyle there. You've got to remember, like, just uprooting your whole life and moving it away with a group of people who are just your friends to then try and start a career making music is just a lot easier said than done. So when it came to the 90s, music was completely shaken up all over the world, and especially in Western culture, obviously with the grunge boom. Nirvana came out and it turned the mainstream upside down. Underground music was all of a sudden the most popular music in the world. And Australia was no exception to this. So many Perth bands continued to try their hand at making original underground alternative rock music after this grunge boom. The scene started growing within, and some big bands started popping up locally. So the first band to kind of make it in this grunge scene that was out of Perth was a group called Ammonia. Now the story with Ammonia goes that they were shown by a guy called Pete Carroll, who was like a WA music aficionado of the time, to John Watson and John O'Donnell of EMI and Sony. And they went on to sign them to this new label that they created called Murmur. And John Watson was also the manager of Silverchair. So funnily enough, Ammonia were actually signed to Murmur before Silverchair were, even though Silverchair are a far more recognizable band these days. So Ammonia ended up finding success here in Australia and then a little bit overseas as well, with their big song Drugs charting in the States. Ammonia would then put them on to another local band in Perth called Jebediah. Now Jebediah had grown to have one of the biggest underage and local Perth followings of the 90s, and their live shows were just to die for. So many people loved them, and they were such an obvious target for Murmur to contact next when it came to signing another Perth artist. Another thing that helped launch Jebediah's career and a couple of other artists was the National Band Campus competition that started bubbling away. They won the competition in 1995, and then in 1997, Eskimo Joe won it too. So after Jebediah won this competition and signed to Murmur, they had the tough decision of deciding whether or not they wanted to move over east to further their career or stay put in Western Australia.
I was still living at home, you know. I was, you know, still getting dinner made by my mum and having my, you know, jocks washed by my mum. You know, I was in no position. I was in no way ready to move over east, I don't think.
And they were able to look at what happened with Ammonia. Now, Ammonia were in a very similar situation to them and toyed with the idea of moving over east. Unfortunately, band conflict destroyed this group and they just fell apart despite putting out some pretty good music. With Jebediah though, around the time of them getting big was also around the time Triple J started to become a national broadcasting radio station. So this helped bands like Jebediah to get a national audience without having to go over east to play in front of live shows, because there was a radio station playing their music in every major city of Australia now. So with that, their songs like Leaving Home and Harpoon and their debut album Slightly Odd Way went really big in the underground music scene all over Australia. And with their success, it helped to usher in more West Australian bands to get spotlight and attention from Triple J and the Australian music scene. So with the success of Jebediah and the help of Triple J, it was proven that you could actually live in Perth and find success as a musician and make a living. And when it came to the 2000s, I would consider this to be the peak of West Australian music. There were so many great WA bands and artists that came out of this decade, thanks to the national broadcaster Triple J and a few other reasons which I'll get to soon. In the alternative rock scene, we had the likes of Gyroscope, End of Fashion, Carnival. Birds of Tokyo, The Sleepy Jackson, Little Birdie.
There goes my baby. She's gotta know, she's gotta know. My heart is stronger than you are. I can't see the point. Come on.
The Panics, The Waifs, the John Butler Trio.
Don't fight it, don't fight it, don't fight it. If you don't know what it is. I'm in London still. I'm in London still.
And of course, Eskimo Joe, who pushed through their success in the 90s to become one of the most commercially successful bands in Australia within the country in the 2000s with their song Black Fingernails Red Wine most notably.
Black fingernails, red wine. I wanna make you all mine.
So the other reasons why West Australian music boomed in the 2000s were because of 1, the internet, and 2, local radio. So with the internet, we had something called MySpace pop up, which helped musicians put their music somewhere that people could just find it at the click of a few buttons. We also had the birth of a website called Triple J Unearthed, which allowed musicians to upload their songs to a website that Triple J presenters and producers could hear straight away and decide whether or not their music would fit on the national broadcaster. We also had a boom in local radio with a community station like RTR giving noticeable attention to many local artists. And I've also got to give a shout out to a radio station that I believe was almost like a perfect crossover of commercial and community, and that was 96 FM, which was at its peak in the 2000s in my opinion, the era of when the catchphrase was Perth's best music. Now this radio station is still around, but unfortunately it's been completely bought out by mega corporations and now just plays very generic old songs that we've all heard thousands of times over and over again. But in the 2000s, 96 FM was actually one of the biggest supporters of successful West Australian music, and they would often be the first place that many West Australians heard the new songs from the likes of End of Fashion, Gyroscope, Eskimo Joe, Birds of Tokyo, just to name a few. Pretty much every time a successful West Australian or Australian rock band put out a new song, it would go straight onto their playlist with heavy rotation. And they were able to mix it in with other Australian rock classics. Shout out to 96FM, does not get the credit it deserves for that 2000s era. So in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, we saw kind of a rise in subculture and genre-specific music. And there's one genre specific to Western Australia that just boomed in this state, and that is psychedelic rock. Now, tracking back to MySpace, a band called Tame Impala uploaded their music to MySpace and were found by a label called Modular, who had a lot of success with a classic rock band from Australia called Wolfmother, and I believe they wanted to find something similar to that. When they found Tame Impala, they soon realized it wasn't actually a band, it was a solo artist. It was just music being made by one guy called Kevin Parker, who uploaded his songs to MySpace. Nevertheless, they signed him, the rest was history, and he released amazing music in the late 2000s and early 2010s that went big all over the world. We had so many other local bands following in Tame Impala's footsteps, with the likes of the Psychedelic Porn Crumpets, Methyl Ethel, and Pond all putting out local psychedelic music, and so many local bands dabbled in this genre. It was quite crazy, and it's still going around to this day actually. We also got the first kind of trinklings of hip-hop music from Perth to find commercial success, with a guy by the name of Draft getting a lot of airtime on Triple J and finding an audience. Electronic music also started to boom in the state due to the fact that so many people could get their hands on music making software and could put it straight out on the internet. We had the likes of Shock One, Elk Road, Crooked Colors, Taku, Slumberjack, Kuchka, and in my opinion, the biggest electronic band to come out of Western Australia, Pendulum. You might know them from some of these ones. We also had a big rise in Australia in the indie rock scene, and of course Western Australia had great representation there too, with San Cisco being our best export. And another person who found a lot of success online was a guy by the name of Troy Sivan, who uploaded his DIY bedroom pop music to the internet and has now risen to become one of the most successful male pop artists in the world.
My youth is yours, run away now and forever.
This all leads up to where we are now, and we have some awesome and successful bands that are up and coming in Western Australia. Some of the most notable bands are surf/indie rock band Spacey Jane, who came up through the local live music scene. Stella Donnelly, who boomed in the late 2010s.
You only like me when I do my tricks for you.
Sly Withers are dabbling in that Australiana thing, which is really big in Australia right now.
You made up your mind again, never really asked the question.
And also the booming surf/reggae rock scene has lent some great Perth acts as well. We've had the likes of Great Gable, Coterie, Old Mervs, and Dice really hitting their straps right now. And we've also seen the rise of social media and streaming now being the way of getting your music into people's ears, with platforms like Spotify, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram being the ways that you grow an audience now. It's almost created quite a substantial dip in the amount of influence Triple J can have now. But that is the story of the Perth music scene. In my opinion, one of the best niche scenes in the world. I just want to pay homage to it. So thanks for watching, and I hope you learnt a little bit about the music from Perth, Western Australia.